What's the worst thing that happened at your child's daycare? My 6-month-old daughter Lily suddenly started sleeping more and more. When I picked her up from daycare one day, she was completely limp in her car seat and wouldn't wake up even when I changed her diaper. I was about to call the doctor when I noticed dried pink residue around the nipple of her bottle. I tasted it and immediately recognized it as the same medication I take for my allergies that always makes me sleepy. Someone at the daycare was drugging my baby. I drove straight back and demanded to speak to the director. She said that was a serious accusation and asked if I had proof of who did it. There were only 2 teachers in the infant room, Miss Carol, who'd been there 10 years, and Miss Jessica, who always seemed overwhelmed with the babies. I told the director the proof was in the bottle and my baby could barely stay awake. She looked at me like I was nuts and said maybe the residue was just formula. I demanded to see the classroom footage, but she said the cameras were for security only and parents weren't allowed to view them without a court order. I took Lily to the emergency room where they confirmed she had Benadryl in her system at levels that were dangerous for an infant. The doctor said prolonged use could cause seizures or breathing problems and asked how long this had been happening. He also said he'd seen 2 other babies from the same daycare with similar symptoms in the past month but hadn't connected the pattern. I realized Lily had been excessively sleepy for at least 3 weeks, but I'd blamed it on growth spurts and teething. The guilt nearly killed me. I called the police from the hospital, explained everything I had learned, but they said without knowing which employee did it, they couldn't arrest anyone. The officer actually suggested maybe I had given her too much medicine and forgot. I was in shock. I went back to the daycare shaking with rage and showed them the hospital report proving Lily had been drugged. Miss Carol barely looked at it and said, "Babies sleep a lot," while Miss Jessica stood there nervously avoiding eye contact. The director read the report and said she would investigate internally, but couldn't take action against her staff based on one child's test results. I demanded that every child at this daycare gets tested like my daughter did, but she said that would be illegal and open them to wrongful termination lawsuits. She actually told me that if I wasn't satisfied, I was welcome to find alternative childcare. I called every daycare within 40 minutes of my job, and they all had waiting lists over 8 months long. I couldn't afford a nanny, and my mom lived across the country, and if I missed another day of work, I'd be fired. I had to take Lily back there the next morning, and I threw up in the parking lot after dropping her off. I started calling other parents from Lily's room and found out 3 other babies had been unusually sleepy lately. One mom said her son had been so drowsy she took him to the doctor thinking he had mono. A dad told me he'd complained to Miss Carol directly about his son's lethargy, and she'd laughed and said he should be grateful for the break. These women were drugging multiple babies, and the director was protecting them. I found out from a former employee that parents had complained about babies being too sleepy in Miss Carol's room for years, but nothing ever happened because she was friends with the director's sister. When I threatened to go to the media, the director pulled out my enrollment contract and showed me the arbitration agreement I'd signed, plus the paragraph that said I'd be liable for damages if I hurt their reputation. Miss Carol must have felt untouchable because when I picked Lily up that afternoon, she smirked at me and said, "Rough day?" I wanted to do something that would get me 25 to life right there in front of everyone, but instead I leaned in and told her I knew what she was doing. She whispered back, "Prove it," and winked at me while my baby lay unconscious in my arms. The next morning, I had to drop Lily off again, and it felt like handing her to a monster, but I had hidden a camera in her diaper bag. I sat in the parking lot watching the live feed on my phone with my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. At 10:15, I watched Miss Carol pull a bottle of children's Benadryl from her personal bag and squirt it into 4 different bottles, including Lily's. She even swirled each bottle to mix it in before placing them in the fridge. She drugged 4 babies in under 2 minutes like it was part of her morning routine. I had her on video committing a felony against multiple infants. I knew exactly what I had to do to end this. I grabbed my phone with both hands to stop the shaking and hit the upload button for my cloud storage. The video started backing up, but the progress bar moved so slow I wanted to scream. I plugged in my USB drive to my car charger adapter and copied the file there too, while watching the upload percentage creep up. My brain kept screaming that I needed multiple copies in case something happened to my phone. I forwarded the video to my personal email with a timestamp showing exactly when it was recorded. The whole time my eyes kept flicking back to the daycare door because part of me wanted to run in there and grab every baby out of that room. Instead, I called 911 and told the dispatcher I had video evidence of a daycare teacher drugging multiple infants with Benadryl. She asked if any children were in immediate danger, and when I said yes, she transferred me to a detective's voicemail. I left a message explaining everything, and that I had video proof of Miss Carol putting medication in 4 different baby bottles. The detective's voicemail said someone would return my call within 24 hours, which made me want to throw my phone through the windshield. 24 hours meant Miss Carol would drug more babies tomorrow while the police did nothing. I walked back into the daycare trying to keep my face normal even though my whole body was vibrating with rage. I told the front desk lady that Lily had a doctor's appointment I forgot about and needed to pick her up early. Miss Carol was holding Lily when I walked into the infant room, and she had that same smug look on her face like she knew I couldn't do anything. She handed me my unconscious baby and said something about Lily being such a good sleeper today. I kept my mouth shut and just nodded because if I opened it, I would have told her I had her on video committing felonies against innocent babies. Lily didn't even stir when I buckled her into her car seat and her little head just flopped to the side. At home, I put Lily in her crib and opened my laptop to create a detailed timeline of every single day she'd been unusually sleepy for the past 3 weeks. I went through my work calendar to figure out which days I'd dropped her off versus my husband, and matched it against the daycare's online parent portal showing which teachers worked each day. The pattern jumped out immediately because Lily only got drugged on days when Miss Carol was working the infant room. She never had excessive sleepiness when other teachers covered for Miss Carol's days off, or when Miss Jessica worked alone during Carol's lunch breaks. I highlighted every single incident in yellow and added notes about how long Lily slept and whether she'd been hard to wake up. Then I started texting the 3 parents I'd talked to before and asked them to meet me urgently at the coffee shop on 5th Street. 2 of them showed up within an hour, and I played the video on my phone while we huddled in the corner booth. The mom started crying and covering her mouth while the dad went completely white and kept saying he couldn't believe it. I showed them my timeline and asked if they could check their own calendars to see if the pattern matched. The mom pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her photos from the past month looking for days her son seemed extra tired. The dad remembered complaining to his wife about picking up their daughter 3 times when she was so drowsy she wouldn't eat dinner. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to stay in constant contact about what to do next. The mom mentioned her pediatrician had run blood tests, but found nothing because they weren't specifically looking for Benadryl. She said she was taking her son straight to the hospital for a new test checking for that specific medication. The dad said he was pulling his daughter out immediately and would figure out childcare later, even if it meant taking time off work. We all agreed to document everything and share any communication from the daycare or police. That evening around 7, my phone finally rang with a blocked number, and the detective introduced himself. He sounded way more interested when I explained I had actual video footage of Miss Carroll drugging 4 different babies, including my own daughter. He said he could meet me at the police station tomorrow morning at 9 and to bring any documentation I had. I told him about the other parents and the pattern I discovered with Miss Carroll's work schedule. He said to bring everything and make copies of all my evidence before coming in. That night, I couldn't sleep at all and kept getting up every hour to check on Lily and make sure she was still breathing normally. Her little chest rose and fell, but she slept so deep it scared me. The guilt of having to take her back to that place in the morning made me physically sick, and I threw up twice before dawn. I knew I couldn't drop her off there again, but I also couldn't lose my job, and we needed my income to pay the mortgage. At the police station, I showed the detective the video on my phone, and he immediately called his supervisor to come watch it too. They made copies of everything, including my timeline, and had me write out a detailed statement about every single thing that had happened from the first day I noticed Lily being drowsy. Something doesn't add up about Miss Carroll being this bold. She's drugging babies right in front of a camera she doesn't know about. But what about all those security cameras the director mentioned? The detective kept asking specific questions about dates and times in which other parents had complained. They took photos of Lily's medical records from the emergency room, showing the dangerous levels of Benadryl in her system. The detective finally looked up and told me they would need to verify the video's authenticity and build a proper case before making any arrests. He said it could take several days or maybe even a week because they needed to coordinate with Child Protective Services and the district attorney's office. When I asked what I was supposed to do with Lily in the meantime, he just shrugged and said I should make whatever arrangements I felt were safest for my child. I walked out of the police station with Lily sleeping in her carrier and sat in my car for 20 minutes just staring at nothing. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah saying she found a legal aid clinic that helped parents with daycare issues and had already made me an appointment for that afternoon. I drove straight there and met with a lawyer who looked barely older than me but knew her stuff. She read through my enrollment contract and pointed out that the arbitration clause only covered civil disputes between me and the daycare, not criminal prosecution. She said going to the media could still get me sued for defamation even with the video evidence if the criminal case didn't result in convictions. She also mentioned that the daycare's insurance company would have better lawyers than I could ever afford. I left feeling more trapped than before and had to pull over twice on the drive to work because I couldn't stop crying. When I finally got to my desk, my supervisor was already waiting for me and asked me to come to her office. She closed the door and said she'd noticed I'd been missing work and seemed distracted when I was there. I tried to hold it together but ended up sobbing and telling her everything about the drugging and the video and how I had to keep taking Lily back there. She handed me tissues and said she was giving me 3 days of emergency family leave starting immediately, but that was all she could do without HR getting involved. I thanked her and went home where I found Sarah's car already in my driveway. She had printed out 30 pages of state regulations about medication handling in licensed daycares and spread them across my kitchen table. We went through each violation we could prove, including unlabeled medications, no written parental consent forms, improper storage and administering medication without documenting dosages or times. Sarah had even found a regulation requiring all medications be kept in a locked box that only the director could access. We took photos of every page and made notes about which rules matched what we'd witnessed. I spent the rest of that day filling out the online complaint form for the state's child care licensing department. I uploaded the video file, the hospital records, and our documentation of regulation violations. The system gave me a case number and said someone would contact me within 2 business days. That evening, Mike texted our group chat saying he'd been digging through old posts on a local parenting Facebook group. He found 3 different parents who'd complained about their babies being unusually sleepy at that same daycare over the past 2 years. One mom had written that her daughter slept 14 hours straight after pickup and she'd switched daycares the next week. Another parent mentioned their son had been so drowsy they thought he had a neurological problem until it stopped when they changed daycares. Mike screenshotted everything and said he was trying to track down their contact information through mutual friends. I decided to try reaching Miss Jessica directly since she always seemed nervous around Miss Carroll. I found her on social media and got her phone number from an old post about selling furniture. When I called, she answered on the 3rd ring, but as soon as I said my name and mentioned the daycare, she hung up. I called back twice, but she didn't answer. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know about her involvement, or at least her knowledge of what was happening. The next morning, the detective called while I was feeding Lily breakfast. He said their tech team had authenticated the video and confirmed it hadn't been edited or tampered with. He asked if we'd gathered any additional evidence since our meeting, and seemed impressed when I told him about the other parents Mike found and the regulation violations Sarah documented. He said having multiple victims and a pattern of behavior would strengthen their case significantly. He mentioned they were working with CPS to coordinate interviews with all the current families at the daycare. After I hung up, my mom called from across the country. I'd been avoiding telling her because I knew she'd freak out, but I couldn't keep it from her anymore. She started crying as soon as I explained what had been happening and kept saying she should have been there to protect her granddaughter. She wanted to fly out immediately but couldn't afford to miss work at her job where she'd just used her last vacation days. We both felt helpless being unable to protect Lily from this nightmare. That afternoon, I got a call from the state licensing department. The inspector said she'd reviewed my complaint and would be conducting an unannounced inspection at the daycare within the next 48 hours. She warned me not to tell anyone there about the visit since they needed to observe normal operations to properly investigate. She said if she found evidence supporting my complaint, they could suspend the daycare's license immediately. I felt the first bit of hope I'd had in days. That night around 11, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Stop stirring up trouble or you'll regret it," with no other information. My hands shook as I took a screenshot and immediately forwarded it to the detective with a message asking if they could trace the number. He responded within minutes saying he'd have their cybercrimes unit look into it and to let him know if I received any other threats. The next morning, my stomach was in knots as I got Lily fully ready for daycare. I kept checking my phone, hoping the detective would tell me not to bring her in, but nothing came through. When I walked into the infant room, Miss Carroll barely looked at me, but I noticed her hands were shaking as she signed Lily in on the clipboard. She kept pulling her phone out of her pocket every few minutes and checking it like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Miss Jessica wasn't even there yet, which was weird since she usually arrived before 7. I kissed Lily goodbye and tried not to cry as I handed her over to this woman who'd been drugging her for weeks. The drive to work took forever, and I kept refreshing my email hoping for news from the inspector or detective. Around 11, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah saying she just saw 3 people in suits walk into the daycare carrying clipboards and official-looking badges. My heart started racing, and I told my boss I needed to use the bathroom so I could text the other parents. Everyone was freaking out and asking if we should go get our kids, but Mike said we needed to let the officials do their job without interfering. I couldn't focus on anything at work and kept making stupid mistakes on spreadsheets I'd done 100 times before. My coworker asked if I was okay, and I just said Lily had kept me up all night. Around 2:30, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was the inspector. She said she'd found multiple violations, including improper medication storage and no documentation for administering any medications to children. She also said several staff members seemed nervous and gave conflicting answers about their daily routines, but she needed more time to complete her full investigation. I asked if the daycare would be shut down, and she said not yet, but they were requiring immediate corrections to several safety issues. When I got to the daycare for pickup, the parking lot was fuller than usual, with parents standing around talking in small groups. The moment I walked through the door, the director appeared out of nowhere and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. She pulled me into her office and slammed the door behind us. "I know you're behind this harassment campaign against my staff," she said with her face turning red. "If you keep spreading these lies, I'll ban you from the premises and you'll have to find someone else to pick up your daughter." I pulled my arm away and told her the hospital had proof Lily was drugged, but she just smiled this nasty smile and said one test didn't prove anything about who did what. When I finally got to the infant room to get Lily, she was passed out in her crib again, even though it was past nap time. Miss Carroll handed me Lily's bag without saying a word, but I could see fear in her eyes for the first time. That evening, Mike called and said his wife, who worked as a nurse at the children's hospital, could test all our baby's hair for long-term drug exposure. She said hair follicle tests could show patterns going back 3 to 4 months, which would prove this wasn't a one-time thing. We set up a time for all the parents to bring our kids to her house that weekend for testing. The next morning, the detective finally called and said they were planning to execute a search warrant at the daycare at 9 a.m. sharp. He told me to find somewhere else for Lily that day because the daycare would be closed during the search. I panicked because I'd already missed so much work, and my boss had warned me about attendance. I called every drop-in daycare within an hour of my job, but they were all full or wanted 72 hours notice for new kids. Finally, I found one place across town that had emergency drop-in care, but it cost $200 for one day. The detective basically told her, "Good luck figuring out childcare while we take our sweet time," because nothing says protect and serve like shrugging off a baby drugging case for paperwork reasons. My credit card was almost maxed out from all the medical bills and tests, but I had no choice. I called in sick to work knowing I was probably going to get written up or worse. The next morning, I drove 45 minutes through rush hour traffic to drop Lily at the emergency daycare. The whole time I kept thinking about what the police might find and whether this nightmare would finally end. I'd just gotten back home when Sarah started texting from the daycare parking lot, where she'd stationed herself to watch everything unfold. She said 4 police cars had pulled up at 9 on the dot, and officers were going inside with boxes and cameras. Parents were showing up for drop-off and being turned away by an officer at the door who said the facility was temporarily closed. Sarah could see through the front windows that staff members were being separated into different rooms, and it looked like they were being questioned one by one. She said Miss Carroll had shown up late and tried to leave when she saw the police cars, but an officer stopped her in the parking lot. Around noon, the detective called to tell me what they'd found. In Miss Carroll's personal tote bag, they discovered 2 bottles of children's Benadryl, along with a handwritten schedule that had initials next to different times. They also found an unlocked cabinet in the infant room with 3 more bottles of various sleep medications that weren't supposed to be accessible to staff. He said they were testing multiple baby bottles for drug residue and had already found traces in 6 of them. That afternoon, I was feeding Lily lunch when Sarah texted that news vans were pulling up to the daycare. I turned on the local news, and there it was. Breaking news about a daycare under investigation for drugging children. Then I saw her, Miss Carroll, being led out in handcuffs with her head down, trying to hide her face from the cameras. The reporter said she was charged with multiple counts of child endangerment and assault. I felt relief wash over me, but also this burning anger that it had taken so long and so many babies had suffered while everyone protected her. That evening, I got a text from another parent saying the director had called an emergency meeting at 7. I left Lily with my neighbor and drove to the daycare with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The parking lot was packed and parents were standing outside in groups talking in low voices. Inside the main room, they'd arranged chairs in rows, and the director stood at the front with her arms crossed, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. She started by saying she was shocked by the arrest and had no idea Miss Carroll was doing anything wrong. A dad in the front row actually stood up and said we should all support the daycare during this difficult time because where else would we find childcare? More parents nodded and murmured agreement than I expected. The director kept saying she'd always run a professional facility and one bad employee shouldn't reflect on the whole center. I stood up and reminded everyone that multiple babies had been drugged for months while she did nothing. The room exploded into arguments with half the parents yelling that the place should be shut down immediately and the other half saying they needed it to stay open or they'd lose their jobs. A mom behind me screamed that I was being selfish and trying to ruin everyone's lives over one incident. Another parent shouted back that drugging babies wasn't just one incident. People were standing and pointing fingers and the director just stood there letting it happen. Someone threw a water bottle across the room and parents started pushing each other. I grabbed my purse and left before someone called the cops. The next morning I was feeding Lily when someone knocked hard on my door. 2 people in suits showed up with CPS badges saying they'd received a complaint that I'd been medicating my child inappropriately. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly what was happening. The daycare was trying to flip this around on me. I let them in and showed them everything, including the hospital reports, the video of Miss Carroll drugging the bottles, and all my documentation. The woman looked through it all carefully while the man watched Lily playing playing on her mat. She said it was clear what was really going on, but they had to keep the case open for 90 days as protocol. She gave me her card and said not to worry about Lily's safety with me, but to call if anything else happened. After they left, I threw up in the bathroom from the stress. 2 days later, I got an email saying the state licensing department had issued an emergency suspension of the daycare's infant room operations. Parents were scrambling to find new childcare, and my phone started blowing up with angry texts. One mom said I'd ruined her life because she had to quit her job. Another parent left a voicemail saying I should pay for everyone's lost wages. I blocked most of the numbers, but the guilt still ate at me, even though I knew I'd done the right thing. Mike called me that afternoon saying he'd been digging into Miss Carroll's background and found something. She'd had a complaint at another daycare 5 years ago for inappropriate sleep management. The complaint was dismissed after she transferred to our daycare, where the director's sister had gotten her the job. He'd found the old complaint in public records and said the details were almost identical to what she'd done to our babies. I asked why nobody had followed up, and he said the other daycare had closed shortly after, so the case just disappeared. My boss called me into his office the next week and slid a paper across the desk. It was a performance improvement plan giving me 90 days to fix my attendance and missed deadlines or face termination. He said he understood I'd been dealing with personal issues, but the company needed reliability. I wanted to explain everything, but knew it would sound like excuses. I signed the paper with my hand cramping from tension. The prosecutor's office called that afternoon saying they needed me to testify if the case went to trial. The woman on the phone explained that Miss Carroll's lawyer was pushing hard for a plea deal to avoid jail time. She said my testimony and video evidence were crucial, but warned me the defense would try to discredit me as a hysterical parent. I said I'd testify no matter what they threw at me. Sarah called me crying the next day because she'd found out Miss Jessica had made a deal with prosecutors. Apparently Jessica knew about the drugging the whole time, but was too scared of losing her job to report it. She'd agreed to testify against Miss Carroll in exchange for immunity. Sarah was furious that Jessica would walk free after watching our babies get drugged every day. I felt the same rage burning in my chest, but at least she was cooperating now. The prosecutor called again 3 days later saying 3 more families had come forward after seeing the news coverage. One baby had actually had a seizure last month that the parents now realized was probably from the Benadryl. Another family had documentation from their pediatrician about unusual drowsiness they'd been investigating for weeks. The third family had kept their baby's bottles and still had residue that tested positive. She said this strengthened the case significantly, and Miss Carroll would probably take the plea deal now. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived from the daycare's insurance company saying they were investigating whether to cover the director's legal defense costs. The letter said if they found evidence of criminal negligence or intentional harm, they wouldn't pay for her lawyer. I immediately forwarded it to my attorney, who said this could pressure the director to settle rather than fight alone. That same afternoon, Miss Jessica called me crying and said she wanted to help. She came to my apartment with a written statement saying the director had explicitly told staff to keep the babies quiet by any means necessary during state inspections. She said the director would walk through the infant room before inspectors arrived and remind them that crying babies could cost them their jobs. Jessica's hands shook as she signed the statement in front of my lawyer. She said she'd been too scared to speak up before, but seeing those test results made her realize how much damage she'd let happen. I started seeing a therapist the next week to deal with the crushing guilt and anxiety. I could only afford sessions every other week, but even that stretched my budget thin. The therapist helped me understand that predators like Miss Carroll rely on parents blaming themselves to continue their abuse. She said my guilt was normal but misplaced since I'd trusted licensed professionals with my child. The hair follicle test results came back 3 weeks later, showing all our babies had consistent Benadryl exposure for at least 2 months. Mike's baby showed exposure for 4 months, which made him throw up when he read the report. The lab tech said the levels were consistent with daily dosing and would have caused developmental delays if it continued. My phone started ringing constantly with local reporters wanting interviews about the daycare scandal. My lawyer told me not to speak publicly until after the criminal proceedings ended. The arbitration agreement still hung over my head like a sword ready to drop if I said the wrong thing to the media. The director was finally arrested on charges of conspiracy and child endangerment after Miss Jessica gave her testimony to the grand jury. Her sister posted the $50,000 bail within 3 hours of the arrest. I watched from my car as she walked out of the courthouse wearing sunglasses and ignoring the reporters shouting questions at her. At the preliminary hearing 2 months later, Miss Carroll pleaded not guilty, while her lawyer argued my videos were illegally obtained. The judge ruled they were admissible since I had a reasonable expectation of privacy for my child's belongings, including the diaper bag. Why would those parents defend the daycare after hearing babies were drugged for months? The director's sister getting Miss Carroll hired makes me wonder how deep this really goes. Family connections covering up past complaints at other daycares seems awfully convenient for keeping things quiet. Miss Carroll's face went white when the judge announced his decision. The prosecutor pulled our parent group aside after the hearing and offered Miss Carroll a deal. She could plead guilty to reduce charges and serve 6 months in jail, plus lose her teaching license forever. Half our group thought 6 months wasn't nearly enough for drugging babies for years. The other half just wanted it over, so they could move on with their lives. Sarah said she'd rather see Carroll get any jail time than risk her walking free after a trial. Mike wanted to reject the deal and push for attempted murder charges. The arguments got so heated that 2 dads almost got into a fistfight in the courthouse parking lot. Meanwhile, some parents started a petition to reopen the daycare under new management, saying the community needed affordable childcare. Others wanted the building demolished and the ground salted, so nothing could ever grow there again. The fighting on social media turned vicious, with people picking sides and attacking anyone who disagreed. Parents who wanted it reopened were called child abuse enablers, while those wanting it closed were called vengeful extremists. Someone leaked my name to a Facebook group, and suddenly strangers were messaging me calling me both a hero and a terrible mother. My performance at work improved slightly once the criminal case started moving forward, but I was still on thin ice with management. A coworker pulled me aside in the break room and warned me that our boss was looking for any reason to let me go. She said I'd become too much drama for the company, and they wanted someone who could focus completely on work. I couldn't afford to lose my job with all the therapy and legal costs piling up, but I also couldn't stop fighting for justice for Lily and the other babies. 3 weeks later, the state inspector called to tell me they finished their investigation, and the daycare's license was permanently revoked. The building owner already had a dental office ready to move in next month, so there was no chance of the place reopening opening under a different name. I sat in my car outside work crying with relief while Lily slept in her car seat behind me. The inspector said they found violations going back years that nobody had reported properly, and the state was changing how they handled complaints because of our case. Miss Carroll's lawyer called my lawyer that same afternoon to say she was taking the plea deal. 4 counts of child endangerment with a recommended sentence of 18 months in county jail. My lawyer said it was better than risking trial where she might get off completely if the jury felt sorry for an old lady. The hearing was set for the following week, and victims could give impact statements if we wanted. I spent 3 nights writing mine and threw up twice trying to practice reading it out loud. The courtroom was packed with parents from the daycare and reporters who'd been following the story. Miss Carroll sat there in a gray suit looking smaller than I remembered while her lawyer whispered in her ear. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she stood up and said she was just trying to manage an impossible workload with too many babies and not enough help. She said parents expected miracles and the owners wanted profits, and she did what she had to do to get through each day. Not one word of apology to any of us or our babies. The judge gave her the full 18 months and she had to surrender immediately. 2 deputies led her out in handcuffs while she stared straight ahead like we weren't even there. The director's hearing was the next day, and she got a different judge who seemed more sympathetic. Her lawyer painted her as a victim too, saying she trusted her staff and had no idea what was happening in the infant room. The prosecutor showed emails where parents had complained about drowsy babies, but the judge said that wasn't proof she knew about the drugging. She got 2 years probation and a $10,000 fine, but no jail time. She also got banned from working in childcare, but her lawyer said she was planning to retire anyway. I wanted to scream when she walked out of court free while our babies were still dealing with what happened. The other parents looked as sick as I felt watching her leave with just probation. I spent the next 2 weeks calling every daycare within an hour of my job trying to find an opening. Most had waiting lists until next year, but finally one place had a spot because another family just moved out of state. It was 50 minutes from work and cost $300 more per month than the old place. The director wanted first month, last month, and a security deposit up front, which came to $2,400 I didn't have. I went to 3 banks before one approved a personal loan at 18% interest. My credit was already shot from the lawyer fees, so it was the best I could get. The new daycare had cameras in every room that parents could watch on an app, and they did background checks on every employee twice a year. CPS sent their final letter saying they closed their investigation of me as unfounded, but the report would stay in their system forever. My lawyer said if I ever got divorced or had any custody issues, the investigation could come up even though I was cleared. She said it wasn't fair, but that's how the system worked, and there was nothing we could do about it. Mike's family and Sarah's family started a group text to coordinate filing civil lawsuits against the old daycare's insurance company. The insurance lawyers immediately pointed to our enrollment contracts, where we'd agreed to binding arbitration for any disputes. My lawyer said arbitration could take 18 months, and the arbitrators usually sided with businesses over individuals. We'd each have to pay $500 just to file for arbitration with no guarantee we'd recover anything. Most of the families couldn't afford it on top of everything else we'd already spent. 6 weeks after I first discovered the drugging, I was still taking Lily to specialists to check for developmental delays or organ damage. The pediatric neurologist said she seemed okay, but some effects might not show up for years. Every time Lily missed a milestone by even a day, I panicked that it was because of the Benadryl. I started waking up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, convinced something was wrong with her breathing. I'd stand over her crib watching her chest rise and fall until my alarm went off for work. Mike and Sarah's families started coming over on weekends, and we'd watch our kids play while barely taking our eyes off them. We couldn't relax even in each other's homes because trusting anyone felt impossible after what happened. Sarah's mom said she quit her job to stay home with their baby because she couldn't handle another daycare. Mike's wife started working nights, so one of them was always home. None of us could afford these changes, but we made them anyway because the fear was stronger than the financial stress. The old daycare building became a real estate office, and I had to drive past it every day on my way to the new daycare. The sign went up on a Tuesday, and I had to pull over because I was crying too hard to see the road. Every morning I'd remember walking Lily in there that last day when I caught Miss Carroll on camera, and my stomach would twist into knots. The real estate people put up cheerful yellow banners and planted flowers where I used to the park when I was dropping off my drugged baby. My performance review came up, and my supervisor sat me down with a stack of papers documenting every day I'd missed or left early. She said she understood what I'd been through, but the company needed reliability and consistency I couldn't provide anymore. She marked me as meets expectations, which meant no raise and no bonus this year. She also put me on a performance improvement plan that basically meant any other absence would be grounds for termination. I signed the paper with my hand shaking and walked out, knowing I was trapped between keeping my job and protecting my kid. The next few months dragged on with lawyers sending letters back and forth while the daycare kept operating like nothing happened. My lawyer said these cases take time, but every week that passed meant more legal bills piling up on my kitchen table. The retainer fee alone wiped out my savings, and now I was putting everything on credit cards at 23% interest. Miss Carroll went to trial 8 months after I caught her on camera, and the prosecutor offered her a plea deal for child endangerment instead of the felony charges she should have gotten. She took it and got 18 months, but everyone knew she'd be out way sooner with good behavior. The other parents started a group chat to share updates, but most of them had already moved on and found new daycares or quit their jobs to stay home. I couldn't do either, so I kept taking Lily to a different daycare 40 minutes away that cost $300 more a month. A year after everything started, we were still stuck in arbitration with the original daycare fighting over whether they were liable for what their employee did. My lawyer kept asking for more money to continue, and I started looking at bankruptcy lawyers online late at night when I couldn't sleep. The legal bills hit $30,000, and I still owed another $15,000 to the hospital for all of Lily's tests and monitoring. Miss Carroll got out after serving just 4 months, and someone in our parent group spotted her bagging groceries at a store 2 towns over. The photo spread through our group chat within minutes, with everyone warning each other to avoid that store. I drove by once just to see if it was really her, and there she was in a green apron scanning items like she hadn't drugged babies for years. Around Lily's 18-month checkup, the pediatrician started noticing she wasn't hitting certain milestones on time and ordered developmental assessments. Miss Carroll got 4 months for drugging babies while parents get lifetime sentences of worry. The math here is more broken than my calculator after tax season. The specialist said she had some delays in speech and motor skills, but couldn't say for sure if it was from the Benadryl or just normal variation. I spent hours researching researching whether prolonged sedation in infants causes permanent damage, but every study said something different. The not knowing ate at me worse than having a definite answer would have. The other parents from the daycare slowly stopped responding to the group chat and moved on with their lives, but I couldn't stop checking every room before I left Lily anywhere. I installed cameras in our apartment, one in her bedroom, one in the living room, and one facing the front door. I checked the feeds constantly on my phone at work until my supervisor warned me about personal phone use. My mom flew out for a week to help and broke down crying when she saw how exhausted I looked. She offered to move closer, but her fixed income couldn't cover rent here, and I couldn't afford to help her relocate. We sat at my kitchen table going through all the bills and paperwork while she kept saying the system should have protected these babies. I bought a locking file cabinet from a garage sale and kept every piece of evidence inside it: the hospital records, the video footage, the police reports, everything. The detective who worked our case called once to check in and mentioned that people like Miss Carroll usually do it again once they think they're safe. He said to keep everything just in case. Lily's second birthday came and she was walking and saying a few words, which the doctor said was good progress. We had a small party at the park with just my mom and 2 kids from her new daycare. When she took her afternoon nap, I still stood by her crib checking her breathing every few minutes. I counted her breaths and watched her chest rise and fall, unable to trust that she was just sleeping normally like any other kid. Some days I could go hours without thinking about it, but then something would trigger the memory and I'd be right back in that hospital room. I started seeing a therapist through my company's employee assistance program, but could only afford 6 sessions. She said I had PTSD and needed long-term treatment, but my insurance wouldn't cover it. I learned to function with the anxiety always there in the background, going to work, paying bills, taking care of Lily. Some days were better than others, and I told myself that had to be enough because Lily needed me present, even if I couldn't be perfect. The arbitration finally ended with a settlement offer of $8,000, which wouldn't even cover a quarter of my legal bills, but my lawyer said it was better than nothing. I signed the papers knowing we'd never get real justice or closure from any of this. Well, folks, it's been quite the journey exploring all these questions together. Thanks for letting me wonder right along with you. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.